Thanks, Tom. So I have been asked to repeat much of what he said by the webcasting guy, so I apologize. This is going to seem awkward, yeah. So I'm Brandon Kendhammer. I teach in the political science department. I'm the acting director of African Studies, and I'm here today to talk about a thing that I do research on, which is the Boko Haram insurgency in northern Nigeria. So some of you are perhaps familiar with this issue or problem. It made a lot of news last year and has sort of been increasingly in Western minds over the last year and a half. It's a pretty big deal in northern Nigeria, I'll tell you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about four things today. So I'm going to situate the particular conflict. I'm going to talk about this Islamist insurgency, Boko Haram, who they are, what they're doing. I'm going to ask questions about what we can do with respect to poverty alleviation to think about ways of mitigating violence, right? It's sort of commonly assumed in Nigeria, northern Nigeria in particular, is a very poor place, that poverty is an important driver of violence, and we're going to problematize that a little bit. And in particular, I'm going to talk about a policy that the US government has adopted to try to combat the relationship as they understand it between poverty and violence globally, called countering violent extremism. I'm going to talk about what the academic research says about the relationship between poverty and violence. The sort of spoiler is that it's not what the US government thinks it is. And then we're going to talk about what we can learn from the Boko Haram insurgency about the prospect of using poverty alleviation and inequality alleviation to actually combat violence. So we'll start with Boko Haram. So this is a map of Africa, Nigeria, and to give you a sense of where Boko Haram is active. They're most active in these three states in northeastern Nigeria, Yobe, Adamawa, and Borno, which are all historically Muslim-majority communities in Nigeria. They've been Muslim-majority communities going back a very, very long time. They were part of the Kanem-Borno Empire in the 15th, 16th centuries. And they are, in addition to being a very important cultural space in Nigeria, a very poor space in Nigeria. The northeastern part of Nigeria is Nigeria's poorest region, and we're going to talk about what the implications of that are as we go forward. So let's talk a little bit about who Boko Haram are. So Boko Haram, it's sort of to give you a sense. So Boko Haram is a Hausa term. It means westernization is forbidden. This is not the name that the group itself adopts. This was a name that was given to them by their opponents, their religious opponents, to sort of make fun of them in the early 2000s. The group's actual name in Arabic translates to the Islamic State in West Africa, which is a new term because they've sort of nominally affiliated themselves with the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. But so to give you a sense, right, Boko Haram as a name implies that they're very strongly anti-West, that they're very strongly anti-Christian Western civilization, and that situates them a little bit. So they've been around in various forms in northern Nigeria for about 15 years now. But in practice, they come up in the mid-2000s around the leadership of this guy named Muhammad Yusuf, who was a prominent preacher working in northeastern Nigeria in the mid-2000s. And what Yusuf's sort of religious argument was that the Nigerian state was a very corrupt place. Economic development really wasn't happening. And despite lots and lots of promises of religious revival, right, northern Nigeria operates in a lot of ways very similarly to evangelical spaces in the United States. There are lots of promises about the role of religious values and religious revival in shifting things. So people were promised in the early 2000s, when Nigeria became a democracy again, that there would be this concerted effort to remoralize society and therefore to make things better for ordinary folks. And it wasn't happening. And so Yusuf, who had worked a little bit with some political figures in Borno State in the early 2000s, starts preaching actively against the government. He's one of the first folks in this period of Nigerian history who kind of come right out and say, the government is so morally bankrupt, this government is so morally corrupt, that Muslims shouldn't have anything to do with them, that we need to separate ourselves from secular society entirely. Okay, and so he runs around making these sorts of arguments for about 4 or 5 years, building a followership. And the grievances that he's talking about are real, right? He wasn't wrong about the Nigerian state in a lot of ways in the mid-2000s. There were a lot of real fundamental issues with respect to political governance, with respect to violence against civilians by the security system. But when you're a preacher making these sorts of arguments, you tend to attract government attention. And throughout the mid-2000s, Yusuf and his group face a lot of state violence and repression. Right? They're sort of constantly sort of picked on and attacked by the Nigerian government. And these confrontations between this group of separatists, Yusuf's group, and the Borno state government come to a head in the summer of 2009, when Yusuf's group is attacked while they're on their way to a funeral. Nominally, they're arrested because they're not wearing motorcycle helmets. And if you've ever spent any time in West Africa, you know that most people don't wear motorcycle helmets. But so they're arrested, they're harassed by the police. The group goes back into their compound, they gather weapons, there's a confrontation. Yusuf is arrested by the Nigerian police, his followers are beaten, some of them are killed, and he is summarily executed behind a police station by the Nigerian military, right, without formal arrest, without any sort of charges being tried. He's assassinated. After that happens, the group goes underground for about a year, right? After this massive amount of violence that's inflicted on them, a lot of their leaders are now dead or in prison, they go underground. And when they emerge the next year, they're led by a gentleman named Abubakar Shekau, who's become increasingly famous in Western circles for the videos that he makes sort of advertising Boko Haram. He has a very unhinged personality. But he had been part of the leadership of Yusuf's group in the mid-2000s, had always been a hardliner. And in 2010, the new group emerges under his leadership when they stage a big prison break to break out a lot of Boko Haram's membership. And between 2010, 2012, or 13, they escalate violence against the Nigerian state. So they begin engaging in a series of increasingly sophisticated terrorist attacks. They had car bombings. In 2011, they bombed the UN headquarters in the capital of Nigeria, Abuja. There's some rumors that they're getting resources or training from al-Qaeda operatives in northern Mali. It's sort of unclear exactly what's happening at this point. But generally, they become more and more violent over these couple of years. They begin mostly by attacking police stations and government offices, but during this period, as they face increasingly brutal counterattacks by the Nigerian government, they also shift to attacking civilians. So this is a picture from a car bombing in Maiduguri, the leading city in Borno State that is in a public place, right? They shift their strategy to become increasingly sort of a normal terrorist group that's taking on civilian targets as well. Now, this is a map that shows you Boko Haram attacks between 2009 and 2015. I'm going to tell you right now that these are probably not entirely true. This is based on Nigerian government reporting. I'm not persuaded that those were actually Boko Haram attacks. But we see that over time, right, so they're able to stage attacks across Nigeria. Nigeria is a big country, so they've got this kind of geographic breadth. But mostly they stage attacks in their home area. And throughout 2013, 2014, as they get more weapons, as they become better trained and more sophisticated in the military side of their operation, they really shift from being a terrorist group to being an actual rebel group and an insurgency. And by 2014, they're seeking to hold territory apart from the Nigerian state, and not so much to govern it, but at least to occupy it. Right? And the turning point really comes in April of 2014 when, in part of this effort, they kidnapped these 278 girls from a girls' boarding school in the town of Chibok in northeastern Nigeria. This is the thing about Boko Haram that most Americans have heard of. Right? To this day, we're not entirely sure where these girls are. The Nigerian government continues to call for their release. There are rumors of negotiation between the Nigerian government and various shadowy Boko Haram operatives, but we're not sure where this is going. Right? Nonetheless, throughout 2014, 2015, Boko Haram escalates and escalates. This isn't the only kidnapping that they engage in. There were a number of others. But because of Boko Haram's effectiveness against the largest military in West Africa, Nigerian citizens also become increasingly engaged with this. Right, so before the kidnapping of the Chibok girls, this was really seen by most Nigerians as being a problem that was isolated to the northeastern part of the country. It wasn't something that the wealthier part of the country in the south was particularly politically engaged with. But as a result of the kidnappings, we see two things happen. One is that there's this global sort of Twitter hashtag movement thing that happens. Michelle Obama has a little Bring Back Our Girls hashtag thing that she holds up. Angelina Jolie has a little Bring Back Our Girls hashtag thing. And this doesn't amount to much because it turns out that you don't change the world by putting hashtags up on Twitter. It does, however, matter a lot in Nigeria. So a group of mostly women civil society activists engage in a series of running protests in Nigeria beginning again in April and May 2014 against the Nigerian government's inaction on the Boko Haram front. And this does matter a lot, right? These folks end up being incredibly important and influential. And I would go so far as to argue that these protests, which generate a really vicious response from the Nigerian government in May 2015, where you have the president's wife saying things in newspaper reports like, if anything were to happen to these protesters, if they were to be beat up or killed, it would be their fault, right, for protesting against the Nigerian government. This really galvanizes popular opinion against the sitting president in Nigeria, and they contribute, I think, very strongly to the election of the opposition candidate, General Muhammadu Buhari, in the elections that took place this spring. So even though the Twitter stuff doesn't matter very much, their domestic protests really changed the shape of Nigerian politics. And as a result of the election of a new candidate, as the result of this sort of sea change in the way that Nigerians are seeing this terrorist problem in the northeastern part of their country, there has been a renewed effort on the part of the Nigerian government to cooperate with the US and other foreign actors in trying to figure out how to deal with it in a fundamental way. Right, so this is the Boko Haram story. Okay, right. So it's also, in addition to being a political story or a terrorist story, it's also a humanitarian story. So right now there are somewhere between 1.2 and 1.6 million internally displaced people in Nigeria who have been driven from their homes as a result of the conflict. Right now the United States is planning on spending about $100 million this year in humanitarian assistance in northeastern Nigeria. The conflict has had implications in Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, which are all, in addition to being nominal French and American allies, also countries with lots of people who have been potentially affected or displaced by the conflict. So it's not just a terrorist problem that's isolated, right? This is something that started to have a very big effect on the fabric of Nigerian life. It's also got food security implications, right? It's very hard to grow crops when people aren't home. And so it's really starting to have these big trickle-out effects for the entire region. So what's driving the conflict? What's the reason that Boko Haram has been so effective? And so where does it come from? Well, the kind of common sense that you get, right, if you talk to most people who are interested in Boko Haram, is that it's a story about poverty and deprivation, right? We said before that northeastern Nigeria is one of the poorest parts of West Africa and the poorest part of Nigeria. And you can see evidence of this in these maps a little bit, right? The northeastern part of Nigeria is, in the north in general, generally poor. GDP per capita is like 6 times less than it is in the southern parts of the country. Educational attainment in the Northeast is very, very low, right? More than half of young men don't attend school. The numbers for women are obviously even much, much lower than that. We also know that Human Development Index stuff, the northeastern states score the lowest on the HDI index. This is on the left there, there's a map showing vaccination levels. Vaccination levels are very low, which is an indicator of the health system's workability. And then this graph, which I realize is a little bit hard to read, shows you percentages of young people who have been affected by malnutrition. So in the northeastern part of the country, almost a little bit over 1 in 4 young people have been in some way stunted in their growth as a result of malnutrition. So we get a sense, and again, if you compare to the other parts of the country where the numbers are much lower, you get this kind of common sense story that this is a part of the country that has a lot of grievances, and it shouldn't necessarily surprise us that we're seeing political violence. It's also a place in which there's a tremendous amount of inequality, right? So the richest man in all of Africa, Akilu Dangote, who's a business owner, is from northern Nigeria, worth $60 billion, I want to say it is. Aside or next to this sort of extraordinary crushing poverty, and this is an image of sort of the typical vision of poverty in northern Nigeria. You have these poor school children who are outside the formal education system. They're in what are sometimes called in other parts of the world madrasas, which is not the northern Nigerian language for them. But they're essentially sort of getting some amount of religious education and begging, right? So this is the image. This is what a lot of folks think of when they think of northern Nigeria, right? So it's an obvious base for potential political grievances. Now, as a result of that kind of common perception of what drives radical violence around the world, the United States government has started to invest a lot of money in trying to counter these problems, right? So in July 2015, there was a program put together, the White House Summit on Countering Violent Extremism, to launch this program that the US is putting a lot of money into, that other European funders are really interested in putting money to, that's designed to use development policy and poverty alleviation to deal with violence, right? The story is that if poverty and inequality, if economic deprivation are driving people to violence, then there is a role to play for foreign aid and development policy in trying to alleviate violence. Right? So the United States invites lots of African leaders to this summit in July. Lots of Southeast Asian and South Asian leaders come to this summit. And it's an important place for the US government to start to articulate what this might look like. Right? And so over the last couple of years, we've seen agencies that are engaged in things as disparate as development policy and law enforcement in the United States start to use this framework as a way to think about how do we prevent people joining terrorist organizations, how do we prevent terrorist organizations from emerging. So USAID, the Agency for International Development, has a large set of programs now. I'm just back from a trip in Ghana, talking with the people who run these programs in West Africa, about using development policy to target people who are at risk of becoming radicalized or joining extremist movements. We've also seen this in law enforcement, and Homeland Security is really interested in countering violent extremist frameworks as ways to deal with problems of, for example, young people potentially joining ISIS out of Somali communities in Minneapolis and Columbus. So we see lots of different potential applications for these kinds of programming ideas, right? How do we get people who are vulnerable, who are poor, who are potentially suffering from inequality or economic deprivation to not become potentially violent, right? This is the sort of narrative. Okay. So, and this is what a CVE analysis looks like. This is from something that was done in Kenya in 2012, 2013, I want to say, looking at the Kenyan coast populations. And it gives you a sense of how a CVE analysis thinks about violence. When the CVE analysis is done, it divides up causes of violence, sort of stories about why people would join violent movements, into two categories. Push factors, things that are existing in society that are trending people towards potentially participating in violence, and what they call pull factors, things that are attractive about organizations that engage in violence that might help them to recruit. And the push factors are almost all about poverty, right? The push factors are social marginalization or fragmentation, right? The decay of communities that are riven by poverty. We've got government repression and poor public policy making. We've got state absence or ungoverned areas. We've got corruption, right? We've got all the sort of key indicators of a society that is breaking down as a result of extreme poverty. And on the pull factors, we've got things, some things that are sort of typical to young men, right? Like adventurism, or a sort of desire to have a different kind of life. But we've also got the idea that radical messages or radical anti-system ideologies are particularly attractive to people who are living in poverty, right? This is the story, that you're far more likely to want to listen to a preacher like Yusuf if you're existing in a situation in which you don't have a lot of other options happening, right? So this is what a CVE analysis looks like. In the interest of full disclosure, I helped to write the CVE analysis in 2013 for Northern Nigeria that USAID did. So, what kind of programming emerges out of this? If this is what you think is driving participation in violence, what do you do about it? The Office of Transition Initiative, OTI, which is a branch of USAID, has been doing this kind of programming in Mali, which is another country that's had some violent extremism over the last few years. And the kind of programming that they do is specifically targeted at dealing with both the push factors but also the pull factors that they're arguing drive violence. So OTI in Mali does things like organized community meetings where people who are seen as marginal to the community, right, who might be excluded from normal decision-making apparatuses, get to meet community leaders and have a say in what's going on. They organize dialogue sessions where leaders of different religious communities or organizations can get together and talk about their differences. They organize soccer games where people from different ethnic groups or different communities can get together and participate in activities, right? The idea is that if we build social bonds and cohesion, people will be less susceptible to violence. It also involves a lot of active counter-messaging against radical groups. So the United States, over a couple-year period, put on 3,000 radio shows designed to counter-message radical violence, right? Don't join Islamist terrorist organizations. There is another way, right? Television programs making these similar kinds of arguments. Again, the notion being that if we target these messages to people who are most likely to join violent groups, this will be an effective way of dealing with the long-term social effects of violence. So this makes sense, right? Now, the thing about the CVE approach, and having worked in CVE just a little bit, I think that there are some real valuable common sense things that come out of this analysis, right? It makes sense to us that there would be a connection between poverty and violence, and that tackling poverty would be a good way to tackle violence. But what does the political science literature actually say about the connection between poverty and violence, right? If we want to figure out whether or not CVE is a good strategy for dealing with extremism, we need to know something a little bit more about what the relationship between poverty and violence is globally. And for those of you who are interested in foreign aid or economic development policy, you know that there's been this big push in economic development to try to test what we do. We want to know if a particular poverty alleviation in one community is actually working and if it might be exportable to another place. So we do what are called randomized controlled trials, or we have other mechanisms to really assess, right? And so what I'm interested in is how do we assess whether or not all of that common sense stuff that we told you actually works, right? And so here's what the political science literature actually says. Right? The first thing that we see or that we learn that's really important, and it sort of makes sense, right, is that on the whole, countries that are poor experience more social violence, right? They're more likely to have wars, civil wars, they're more likely to have insurgencies and rebel groups, and those violent conflicts are likely to last longer, right? This is, again, I think is entirely commonsensical. Countries that are poor are less resilient when it comes to combating violence, and they're more likely to see violence flare up. Okay. However, and this is interesting, when we look at groups within countries that might be susceptible to engaging in violence, we don't see that same relationship. Economic deprivation, inequality, and poverty don't actually seem to be strong predictors when we drill down about which groups within a country are likely to engage in violence against the state. Right? This is a counterintuitive story. It is often not the poorest and most marginalized populations or individuals that are likely to participate in anti-state violence. Now, why might that be, right? What might be driving that odd finding that it's not the people who are most repressed or most marginalized who are participating in violence? Anybody have a theory on that? What might be explaining that story? I think this is really important, right? And you've heard me make this argument a little bit before, right? Violence is a form of collective action. People who are going to engage in violence against a repressive, usually state that's interested in putting that violence down have to cooperate. They have to work together. They have to build a common message. They have to build a set of institutions. They have to find weapons, right? They have to train. All of these things are harder when you are at the bottom of the economic ladder, right? You're too busy carving out the very basics of your daily life, right? In fact, what we see is that oftentimes the most well-organized or the best violent extremist groups with respect to their ability to launch attacks often emerge in not the poorest places, but in places that are a little bit well off, a little bit better off, where people have the kinds of resources that they need to actually begin organizing violence. They still have grievances, but they have the ability to mobilize around those grievances in different ways, right? And so interestingly enough, when we drill down to the individual level, when we start thinking about the problem of creating violent movements or joining violent organizations as an individual level problem, again, one of the interesting things that we see, and a lot of this research has been done in Pakistan in particular, is that the poorest folks in societies are often less inclined to support terrorist organizations, even when they share a common ideological background, than better off and middle-class people. In Pakistan, in particular, support for the Taliban and for al-Qaeda seems to be more popular among middle-class folks than among the poorest of the poor. And again, I think if you think about it at a micro level, this starts to make a little bit of sense, right? Poor people are more likely to be impacted by daily violence, right? Their livelihoods are more likely to be disrupted by terrorist attacks or bombings that take place in public places like markets. They're less likely to see violent organizations as providing an actual way out or an alternative to the current status quo. Whereas people who have a little bit of education, who are a little bit better off, are more likely to both have the sort of safety and security to actually make a move like support a radical organization, but they're less likely to be impacted by what that radical organization is actually doing on a daily basis. So this, again, I think is both counterintuitive and a little bit intuitive when you dig down into it. However, and this is important, poverty and lack of opportunity can push particular individuals into joining conflict movements. And again, we know this. Largely not because of radicalization or because of a common ideology, but because if you're in a conflict zone, a rebel group might be the only way for you to meet your basic needs, right? If the crops haven't come in this year because of violence. It might be that you're worried about protecting your family, so you join a rebel group or an insurgency as a way to provide cover for your community of people who are still living in the area where conflict is happening. And because rebel groups and insurgencies recognize that by imposing costs of non-participation, right, by making it risky for people to not join by threats against their family or members of their community, that they can recruit in that manner, right? So support for violence is relatively lower among the poorest of the poor, but there are risks for people joining movements. A couple of other things that we know, right? We know that radicalization drivers, right? The direct kind of religious appeals that this is the correct teaching of my faith system, that we need to engage in violence. Again, that's far less likely to work with the poorest of the poor than it is among people who have a religious education or even a secular education. One of the odd findings in the political science literature is that doctors and engineers are overrepresented in radical extremist groups because they've got a little bit of scientific training, but not a lot of scientific training. We know that rebel groups and terrorist organizations often rely on financial incentives to recruit. We've seen this particularly in Boko Haram. But when they don't have money, they turn to coercion. You see the inscription of child soldiers, for example, when rebel groups that used to have money don't have money anymore. And then finally, we see that state violence against civilians really is the one thing that can push people to join radical groups, all else being equal. That if the state is rounding up people in a non-organized way, if there's strong state repression against entire communities who are being targeted or seen as participating in violence, that tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, that people will join those groups if they're already being targeted or treated as though they're part of those groups. So how are we doing on time? So what does this mean for an organization like Boko Haram? Well, one of the things that it means is that even though we don't have a ton of information about who joins Boko Haram, it's very hard to interview former Boko Haram members and say, why did you join this rebel group? We do have a little bit of information, right? One of the things that we know is that the community that is generally assumed to be the most marginal, the most likely to want to join a radical extremist group. We talked about them before. They're those young Quranic school children in Hausa, the Al-Majirai, are not actually overrepresented among participants of the group. There are about 9 or 10 million of these Quranic school children in northern Nigeria, and only about 6,000, 7,000 Boko Haram members. So despite the idea that they would be the most vulnerable, they're not joining up in the group in droves. Well, who does seem to be joining up? It's other youth who are in the conflict zone, right? Recruitment for Boko Haram tends to happen either just outside the conflict zone through financial incentives. Again, we're a little bit thin on our information, but this is the best we can do. Or with youth who are living in the conflict zone. People aren't coming from outside to join. They're joining up, for the reasons that we cited on the last slide, to protect their families, to meet basic needs, because the cost of non-participation is high. Again, this is an image that comes from a Boko Haram Twitter feed that was active in February 2015, showing a group of young people who were nominally radicalized into Boko Haram. The story here, again, I think is pretty clear, that as Boko Haram has faced greater military pressure from the Nigerian army, they've turned to coercion for recruitment, right? These folks have not been radicalized. They're there because the Nigerian state is not able to provide security for young people. Right? So again, this cuts against our sort of common sense expectations about what drives people to participate in violence. The third factor that I want to highlight in terms of participation in Boko Haram is that there really has been extraordinary state violence against citizens who are just living in that northeastern area. Amnesty International has recently accused the Nigerian military of committing gross human rights violations against northern Nigerian civilians. Between 2009 and 2013, the Nigerian military actually killed more civilians than Boko Haram did in the northeastern part of the country. They tend to round up young men wholesale in communities, imprison them. There have been fairly credible accusations of mass violence against detainees. And they've collaborated with civilian vigilante groups to go after entire communities that they see as being sympathetic to Boko Haram. Right? This is a push factor, getting people to participate in Boko Haram. If your community is going to be treated like you're supporting Boko Haram, there are relatively few reasons not to participate in Boko Haram. Right? Sorry. So what does this mean for the kinds of policies that would seem to be commonsensical in that first telling, right? What does this tell us about what we might do better when we're thinking about using development and poverty alleviation to combat violent extremism? Well, one thing that it tells us is that these kind of efforts to counter radical messages and build community, things like soccer games, they may have value, right? It could be that poor communities really are generally experiencing ties breaking down, right? That doing these kinds of programming might have positive benefits. But they also reflect flawed assumptions about who participates in radical groups in the first place. And there's a political science professor at Purdue University named Dan Aldrich who's actually looked at USAID radio programming to counter radical messages. And he finds that while they do have a good effect in making communities feel more united, they don't seem to do anything to deter people from joining radical groups, right? Because that's not why people are joining radical groups in the first place. They also tell us that financial incentives and coercive recruitment can't be countered or can't be dealt with by development programming or peace building alone, right? If you're coercing young people into joining your group, or people are joining because of these push factors having to do with meeting basic needs, coming in and doing peace building in that community, doing reconciliation, isn't necessarily going to solve those problems. What's going to solve those problems is providing state security in those areas, right? And then finally, state violence can probably undo even the best efforts to use poverty alleviation as a way to deal with violence. Even if you're raising overall economic situations, even if you're providing agricultural assistance, even if you're doing peace building, if the state is still rounding up young men and killing them, it's going to be very difficult to, in the long term, prevent recruitment into violent extremist groups. So that's, I think, the Boko Haram experience teaches us some really important lessons about both the prospects but also the not strong prospects about the relationship between poverty and violence. It's not, generally speaking, as simple as, oh, we're going to lift people out of poverty, we're not going to experience violent extremism. So that's what I've got. I'd be interested if you have any questions. Hi.
Hi, I'm Young Kimichi, European. Thanks a lot for your very informative and entertaining talk. That's fantastic. And my question is, your point on the state violence, that's excellent indeed. Thinking about, say, a lot of rebel groups were violent extremism in South and Southeast Asia, or Asia in general. That's many of those who joined that, let's say, in Sri Lanka, or let's say East Timor, Nepal, or in the 1970s, it's Bangladesh, Pakistan. Many of them indeed, those soldiers were extremists. They learned that how to use this machine gun by the colonial government or Cold War government. So they obtained the particular military training by the state institutes. And then once the Cold War government's gone, colonial government's gone, and then they wanted to use the skill. The military training was more like education. So they wanted to make use of those skills. So that's why they joined. So I think that idea really applies to Asia too. But one thing here, I might be wrong, but this international media attention on Boko Haram, that might have helped those rebel groups or extremists to raise funds, or that they can thrive on international media attention. So in the case of Asia, this international media attention and the military intervention, those two things have to go together to solve the problem. Media attention alone indeed help the rebel groups.
So I've been asked by the webcasting people to repeat the questions, but you've asked one of those wonderful academic lecture questions that we all do. So there's no way I can repeat that. But more or less the question is, what role might international media or international attention actually play in making rebel groups stronger, right? That they're able to attract attention and therefore support. I think it depends on where you get your money from, right? If you're funded by diaspora participants, right, like the IRA was, right? If you've got people sending checks from the United States back, international media attention is obviously really good for your organization. If you're being funded by outside financiers of some sort, we know Al-Qaeda has been in the past, these are probably good things. In as much as Boko Haram has gotten any kind of assistance from Daesh, from the Islamic State, it wouldn't surprise me if that international attention played a role in kind of making them a serious actor. But for the most part, at least in 2014, Boko Haram was getting its funding from knocking over banks in northeastern Nigeria, from sort of, stealing agricultural goods. They were getting their funds, or they're getting their weapons from stealing them from the Nigerian police and the military. And so in that sense, I mean, this is, again, the best information that we have suggests these sorts of things. Nigerians will tell you sometimes different stories, but I've seen as much of the open source stuff as you can. It's not clear to me that they were driving fundraising or getting recruiting in that way. So again, I think it just depends on where you are or what your particular situation is. In 2015, it might look a little bit different for a group like Boko Haram. Certainly for the Islamic State, right? They latch onto little hashtags on Twitter and try to use those as recruiting tools. I think it really just depends on what your group is up to.
What is the general attitude of people who live actually in the south, towards the people, not the Boko Haram people, but general people who live in northeast Nigeria? Is there any sentiment, sympathy, or they just don't care?
It varies a lot. So Mila has asked sort of what's the relationship between folks outside of the combat area, particularly in southern Nigeria, and the conflict in the northeast. So I'll start with the sort of dispassionate stuff, which is the survey data. The Gallup's partners in Nigeria in 2013 did a survey asking people to what extent they'd been impacted by Boko Haram in all the different regions. And obviously it told us the sort of story that you would expect, which is that people in the southwestern part of the country and the southeastern part of the country reported that they had not been affected in any real way by Boko Haram. People in the northwest and the north central and the northeast said, we've been impacted a lot by Boko Haram. Again, I think that's sort of non-controversial. I would argue that the events in 2014, the kidnapping, did galvanize popular opinion in the South that there was a real problem in the North. Again, Nigerians will tell you a variety of different stories. It's a country of 180 million people with 180 million different sort of stories about how this all happened. But my general sense is that there was this kind of moment where, I mean, I'm going to speak colloquially here, where people were watching Good Luck's ministers on international TV on CNN, and they had no answers to what was going on, right? That they had no story about what the problem was. And they were very dismissive of the idea that anybody ought to be interested in this. This is a domestic security matter. And that this embarrassed people, particularly in the political elite in southern Nigeria, and sort of was a sign that this was not a serious administration that was really committed to dealing with this problem. I think at the base level, we haven't had another survey, and so I don't know exactly. I don't want to generalize over much, but my sense is that for a lot of people in southern Nigeria, this is still sometimes perceived as a problem that's happening up there, which is, I guess, not surprising. So Magadou has asked about the ideological drivers, right? To what extent are globalized visions of Islam in particular driving conflict? And I will admit that my position is not the orthodox one. I get yelled at about this a lot. I've yelled at a few people about it, right? We don't always disagree, or we always agree. So Boko Haram starts as a Salafi Islamist movement in the sense that they identify with this notion of returning to a pure vision of the faith that's grounded in the experience of the Prophet and people who lived in the immediate generations after his death, right? So this is where they come from ideologically. And there are a lot of Islamist violent movements that come from that place ideologically, right? So there's this kind of thin association between those two things. But my sense, and again, I study this for a living, although a lot of Nigerians don't agree with me, is that most Salafis in Nigeria are not at all interested in Boko Haram, right? That the vast majority of Salafi mainstream movements in northern Nigeria have, if you speak Hausa, spoken out widely and very, very critically against Boko Haram, precisely because they're worried about being tarred with the same brush. They don't want to lose the benefits that come from being able to work with the government because of the Boko Haram insurgency. And so there was actually, my colleague at Georgetown, Alex Thurston, wrote a wonderful paper last year detailing, because he's a really great Hausa speaker, all of the ways in the local and trans regional media that these Salafi leaders are speaking out against Boko Haram, right? That said, when you're looking at it from this distance, sometimes those distinctions get a little bit fuzzy. And so I think that there has been a tendency from the international analyses, to lump those folks in all together. But my story is that we don't see a lot of evidence that people are joining Boko Haram because they agree with its ideology religiously. I think that there are relatively few people within that organization who are true believers in Yusuf's original vision or whatever Shekau's vision is now. I think that there are a lot more people who've joined because of financial incentives, because they've been coerced, or because they're trying to protect their families in conflict zones.
I'm curious, since you were just in West Africa and you've had some engagement with USAID, whether your argument here is having some influence, and obviously you know others who are making this argument as well. I mean, is U.S. policy starting to reflect that this concern that it's not poverty alleviation, but it's broader questions about human rights, state capacity, those kinds of issues?
I mean, so I will preface this, because we're being web streamed out to the world, that I think that USAID does a lot of really important work in this area, right? And as someone who's done contract work with them, I think that they do a lot of really important work in that area. I'm nonetheless really critical of the CVE framework, because I think it doesn't reflect the best information that we have about why people actually participate in violence. I think it's not nearly as sophisticated as it needs to be. And to me, the bigger problem is that if you want to build boreholes in a village, you've got to do elaborate trial-based, evidence-based work to show that that's the best use of your funds. If you want to put together radio programs to counter violent extremist messages, you don't have to do any of that work at this point. None of the evidence-based stuff that you see in other realms of development has really trickled into CVE yet. I mean, partially because there's not a lot of funding, right? When you talk to people and you say, well, why don't you sort of set up a control and see whether or not people are joining in these communities where you're not targeting the message? And they say, we don't have any resources to do that. I'm sympathetic to that argument. But my sense is that there's still an awful lot of pressure to do something, which is sort of endemic in development work, and that this is the something that sort of makes sense given the framework. It's just not clear to me that it represents the most possibly sophisticated vision of what the real drivers of violence are in any particular instance. Oh, Dorcas?
What's the relationship between political alienation and
Between political what?
alienation?
Alienation.
Yeah, like the northern part of Nigeria. I'm just thinking, if it's not only poverty that can drive people
Right.
to join this Boko Haram, is there a relationship between political alienation
Right.
and people joining?
So what you have asked is there any relationship between political alienation from the system and participation? And so here I'm going to get in trouble again with Nigerians, anybody who's watching. My sense is that pretty much every community in Nigeria would argue that it's marginalized or in some way not getting the full benefits of the federal bargain. It's a particular characteristic of the Nigerian political system, that everybody is in a position to claim we're the ones who are getting screwed by the system, which can't possibly be true, right? Some folks are doing better than others within that system. I have books in my office where you see like two chapters, one by a Muslim Nigerian scholar, one by a Christian Nigerian scholar, and the Muslim scholar will say, Christians have always dominated everything about this country. And the Muslim scholar will say, Christians have always dominated everything, but they can't, like, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And so alienation is not an objective thing, I think is the point that I want to make. That alienation is always relative based on your standing, based on the standing of the political community that you're participating in, based on the network of the leaders of that political community. And so it's rarely the case that any community in a country like Nigeria is fully marginalized and alienated or entirely getting all of the benefits and the goodies of being in the system. Which suggests that what we need is a more micro-level approach. And in as much as there are truly alienated people in Nigeria, really, really poor young people in the northeastern part of the country would be good candidates, because there aren't a lot of ways for them to have any impact on the political system. This is probably true of youth in other parts of the country as well. And there's been violence by youth in other parts of the country as well, and there's been violence by non-Muslim youth across Africa for precisely these same reasons, right? So in as much as that's true, I mean, I think alienation does matter, and if you can combat alienation, I know USAID is now funding this program where they're putting up a Kanuri language radio and TV station, not because I think that they really believe that it's going to counter radical extremism, but because hearing people speak your language in media is a useful thing for feeling like you might have some level of efficacy. And so I think that that's really important and interesting. It is very hard to measure that as a political scientist. So I've rambled a little bit, but that's my answer.
Are there any expectations from the new administration in terms of tackling the issue of redistribution of the resources to address the discrepancy between the two regions on group level?
So Mila has asked what the new administration in Nigeria might do about this. So the new administration has made a lot of promises about, first of all, militarily dealing with the Boko Haram problem. And the evidence is sort of mixed about where they're at with that right now. There's certainly a sense that the U.S. is more likely to cooperate with this administration militarily than the previous administration, which had really been very standoffish with cooperating with the U.S. militarily. The message that the current Nigerian administration is giving is we're going to deal with corruption, right? We're going to deal with the problems that marginalize all Nigerians. I think that this is a smart political message. I think that combating corruption in Nigeria is not something that one four-year presidency is likely to be able to solve. But it's a clever way of dealing with that bigger problem, which is that if you shift resources to the northeastern part of the country, and there have been calls for like a Marshall Plan for northern Nigeria where there's this big influx of funds to try to deal with the developmental issues, in the Nigerian context, those funds have to come from some other community. Right? And so it's very difficult politically to set up that kind of transfer of resources. And so I think you're going to see huge humanitarian spending right now. Whether that'll translate into long-term development assistance, like I've talked about agriculture a lot as a really important thing in northeastern Nigeria to get people back on their feet. Whether we'll see that from the international community, I think is anybody's guess. But I think it's smart of the current administration not to say we're just going to put a bunch of money into northeastern Nigeria, but to say we're going to deal with these kind of broad-based problems. But it's tough, right? There's this whole saga right now with the Senate president getting arrested and not arrested and tried for corruption. It's a huge problem to deal with.